Today I'm going to talk about the legacies of the freedom movement. The freedom movement in India, it was one of the greatest movements of human history, and so its implications and legacies are not only for India, but it is for the whole of the world, and beginning from individual to society to global society, for everything there is a great legacy. But there is some problem to begin with about understanding properly the legacies of the freedom movement. This problem arises out of the complexities of the political regime at that time, because India was under subjugation during the freedom struggle, and so it was fighting for freedom at that time. So many things were portrayed at that time in a different color. What we can call a part of the freedom movement, what we can call sacrifice of a patriot of this nation, that was portrayed by the British something like a crime, something like a dacoity, and odd type of revolutionary activities. So this is just a small example, but there are other examples. For example, we don't know about several things because we don't have records. The records were either they weeded out, they were burnt, or they are just traceless. So about several things our knowledge is limited. For example, about the revolt of 1857. So this we have to keep in our mind. Another factor which made the whole situation complex, that in the last part of the freedom struggle there was a cross current of forces in India from all over the world. British Empire was phasing out, it was withdrawing from India gradually, and so simultaneously other powers, especially led by United States, they were entering the Indian scene. And these things created, already there was influence of the socialist movement in Russia. So all these things made the whole picture quite complex, and from that we will try to extricate certain basic values, certain basic legacies which have influenced our development after independence. This is our approach, from where we will begin with the political legacies of the freedom movement. In fact, the first and the foremost legacy of the freedom movement was the concept of liberty and freedom, for which it was active, which it achieved, and which has benefited not only India, rather the whole world under subjugation. So the freedom, the sense and concept and the idea of freedom, that was one of the greatest gifts of our freedom movement to our nation and to humanity. This sense of liberty, this sense of and the reality of freedom was gradually articulated into social realities, into economic equation of society and individual, and its interaction with the complex plethora of factors. So this liberation that led to first liberation from the foreign rule, then liberation from exploitation from internal indigenous forces also. Likewise, then liberation from poverty after independence. All the governments, they have been trying for liberation from poverty, liberation from discrimination, liberation from religious persecution, and things like that. So this the sense and concept of liberation, liberty, and freedom, it has been a great contribution of the freedom movement for the progress and development of this country. Likewise, another thing, if we try to visualize the sense of freedom in much more concrete political terms, then we can say that the next contribution of the freedom movement was the concept of democracy. The whole struggle against the British rule was against imperialism, against exploitation, against cruelty of one group of society against another. So, if it had to be removed, there was to be some alternative, and the freedom movement gradually developed an alternative concept against the colonial rule, and that came in the form of political democracy. It came here, and so after independence, especially the government of Free India, all the successive governments, they have to try to underline the basic elements of democracy in our governance, in our public life, and so a lot of, apart from constitution, which was another concrete contribution of the freedom movement, there have been hundreds of administrative measures to bring about the basic concept of democracy in this country that has been introduced in not only in political arena, but also in the field of economic life, in our, even in our cultural life, some type of democracy, some type of equality, some type of freedom for all to enjoy the cultural heritage. This is a type of democracy in action in our country, and this is the contribution of the freedom movement. I'm not talking just that the freedom movement all of a sudden it got the concept of democracy. No, there was a gradual evolution throughout the freedom movement towards an alternative concept against the colonial rule. That began with the economic critique of the colonial rule in our country from the time of Dada Bhai Nauroji and R.C. Dutt and scholars like that. Later on, it was taken up by others, including during the Swadeshi movement, but much more clearly in the time of Mahatma Gandhi, after his arrival on the Indian political scene, say after 1917 or 1916, this concept started crystallizing. In the end of 1920s, say 1930, the concept of Purna Swaraj and the expression of fundamental rights, which was visualized by the International Congress, all these things, they led to a concept which is now we are practicing as democracy. So we owe a lot to the freedom movement about the concept of freedom and about the concept of democracy and its actual working in our country. Likewise, another legacy of the freedom movement was a new means and method of political action. This was contributed by several others, but much more by Mahatma Gandhi. This method, to be much more explicit, I will let you know that it was the concept of non-violence, satyagraha and non-violence. This was an entirely new method to fight a political struggle. Initially, it was not taken seriously. Some people thought that this is just abstraction and it's not practicable idea. But we know that it worked, and it has worked all over the world, not only in India. And this concept of satyagraha or ahimsa as a means of political goal, it's now working all over the world, and people from different parts of the world, they are trying to articulate it and apply it with their own social problems. This concept of satyagraha and ahimsa, it was deep rooted in India's tradition, in India's philosophical tradition and the concept of culture in this country. And so it was entirely novel for the whole of the country. It was not an import from any Western idea, rather it was entirely indigenous. The goodness of this concept is the fact that it can be applied not only for political action but for the whole aspect of life. And so this is how the concept of satyagraha and ahimsa, and that way the Gandhian philosophy is still a vital force in our thinking, whether we like it or not, but it is difficult to ignore it even in the times of consumerism and Western type of globalization. So this was the idea, a new idea of means and method. This idea of ahimsa also encouraged people to fight for their rights, right for vote, different type of civic rights for which society is fighting, even at times against the government after independence, even today. And this spirit of fight on the basis of satyagraha and ahimsa, it has worked, because it makes any violent reprisal from the side of government very difficult, because no one is creating any violence. So it is difficult for the other side to counter it with any form of violence. So this was one of the greatest achievement and legacy of the freedom movement. Likewise, just as a corollary of this type of philosophy, there has been in India, even after independence, some value of ethics in society, some value for the whole of humanity, and it is the Indian nation which is not following any aggressive policy even in international scene. Rather, it has started with the movement of non-alignment. It has always called for international peace. It has always called for international cooperation. And now, in recent time, India is rising above most of the countries about conserving and preserving the environment, not for Indians, but for the whole of the mankind. So these are the contributions and these are the values which have set a trend for whole of humanity today, and it came from the freedom movement. We will also talk about economic legacy of the freedom movement, which is not different and which is not extricated from the political legacies of the movement. Because both of them, they started, as I have referred to earlier, that towards the political legacy, one of the earliest development was the rise and formation of a economic critique of the colonial rule by Nauroji, Dadabhai Nauroji, R.C. Dutt, P.C. Ray, Mahatma Gandhi, M.N. Roy, M.N. Nehru, and then Subhash Chandra Bose, and scientists like M.N. Saha and P.C. Ray. These were the great Indians who also participated very actively in the freedom movement, and they articulated a critique of the colonial rule. It means they saw the whole economic operations and consequences of the colonial rule from the viewpoint of the welfare of the people of this country, and they found that India was exploited throughout the British rule. Its wealth was drained out, its growth was stunted. Whatever India could do and it tried, it was deflected from a natural course, whether it was in the field of economy, in the field of culture, in the field of science and technology. It was deflected, and this understanding came initially and primarily from the economic critique of the colonial rule. This concept of colonial, the critique of the colonial rule, this led to a lot of other developments. For example, it led to the idea of and call for national reconstruction. This call started, in fact, it has started in the last part of the 19th century, but definitely the Swadeshi movement was one of the major landmarks in this direction. The Swadeshi movement called for self-reliance boycott of foreign goods, and efforts to regenerate society with self-help, without any help from the outside, and also based on indigenous talent. So this was the first step, but there were other steps also, other landmarks also. For example, during the First World War, when the colonial government talked about reconstructing India, but its reconstruction program was just focused on industrialization. For the development of the country, the government, the British Indian government, they appointed a high power committee under Holland, the Indian Industrial Commission. That commission was focused on finding out the ways and means how to industrialize India and develop it in economic terms. But the whole concept was very soon challenged by indigenous leaders. For example, Madan Mohan Malviya, who was one of the members of the high power committee, he objected to the whole concept of that survey and he refused to sign it. So this created a lot of problem at that time, but finally he was persuaded and he agreed to sign it only with a note of dissent. Of course he signed it, but that note of dissent is one of the great documents of what we can say the science policy of the country, which emerged later on. In this report, I am just briefly talking about the content of the report. Malviya challenged the concept of the British that they were going to industrialize the country. He said that though this is not proper expression to call the whole exercise, because India was always a highly industrialized country, in fact up to the coming of the British and exactly up to the 18th century. When the British started their economic operation in India, this industrialization started withering away. So he equated the fall of Indian industries with the rise of industrialization of the British Empire. And he said that as the British Empire emerged, industrial revolution started there, so the Indian resources were consumed by the industrial revolution and Indian skill and Indian resources were looted during this period. So this was the concept which he put forward, and he said that if at all India has to be developed industrially, the British should consider calling the whole exercise re-industrialization of the country, because he challenged and he said that India was always industrialized, and if at all it was in a decayed situation in the 20th century, it was entirely and wholly on account of the British rule. This had political implication, because if the British accepted this idea of re-industrialization, it means their whole thesis that India had been a backward country and it was the white man's burden to develop it will go to a naught. So this was the problem. Not only that, he put forward specific examples from all over the country and from several sectors of society where he proved how the Indian industry, economic activities, trading, marketing, how and even the skill, how it was stunted and forced to die out on account of the British rule. That is why the British very soon threw away the whole report of the commission and they didn't talk about industrialization of the country again. All this happened in during 1916 and 18. Soon after came Gandhi on the national scene and through Gandhi's emphasis on agriculture and rural reconstruction, the British found an alibi not to talk about industrialization as if they were supporting the Gandhian program of development, which was not truth, but they tried to give an impression of that type. So this was the process and the stages of development, how the nation, Indian nation, came to realize the importance of development and planning. The most important development took place during 1920s and 30s with regard to national reconstruction and planning also. In the first phase came Gandhi. He called for the reconstruction of the village India, that was rural reconstruction, and for that he presented a whole program. Of course, that program was not fully supported by every area of the segment of society. Nevertheless, it was a powerful Congress program, even as a non-Congress program, as a program of one individual, Mahatma Gandhi. It was a significant development which gave an idea through trial and error about how to develop the country. But by early 1930s, the whole clear idea of national reconstruction with proper scientific planning came into being. One of the earliest leaders who called for national reconstruction was Visvesvaraya. Visvesvaraya, he was in favor of developing this country on the capitalist model. For that, he wrote articles in journals and also a book on how to reconstruct India. Very soon, he was joined by several others. For example, J.D. Birla, he also presented a plan for national reconstruction. And by this time, another factor came into being, and that was influenced by socialist development in Soviet Russia. The impact of socialism in India had started brewing into, say, from soon after the revolt of 1917. By 1925, the Communist Party was established, and by early 1930s, a section of the young Congress leaders, they started thinking in terms of socialist development in the country. Among the most important leaders from that group were Jawaharlal Nehru, Subhash Chandra Bose, JP, and several others. All these people, they constituted a separate group within the Congress to promote the idea of socialism. So this idea of socialism and planning, they became one of the vital factors of the light at that time, and they have been one of the most important contribution after independence. The turning point came about planning and national reconstruction in 1938. In 1938, the Congress constituted a National Planning Committee, which is popularly known as NPC. But the story needs some much more explanation, because it was, of course, apparently it was a Congress affair, but there were several other people who participated and helped it to be formed. And one of them was M.N. Saha. M.N. Saha was a great scientist of that time, and he has been one of the greatest scientists of this country who made a seminal contribution to global science, especially in the field of astrophysics and several other areas. But he was the first generation as a crop of the Swadeshi movement. So, apart from being a scientist, he was also interested in social and political problems. He was very much concerned about the subjugation of the country. He wanted the freedom of the country. He wanted the development and reconstruction of the national life in every sphere. So all these things were troubling him for some time. He was a very open-minded person. Of course, he was influenced by socialism, but he looked to the developments all over the world, including in the USA. And he gradually started surveying what were the basic problems hindering the progress of the country. Of course, the foreign rule was very much there, troubling the country, but he found another things also. For example, the management and control and exploitation of the natural resources. And in that direction, the first thing attracted his attention was the resource of water. But he was not attracted exactly and immediately about water as a resource, rather as a curse for the society in terms of recurrent floods and then regenerating famines in the country. So the flood attracted his attention and he became active to find ways and means how to control and exploit the rivers of the country, water of the country. Likewise, he also thought about exploiting other resources, even using water as a generator of electricity, as a means of transport and communication, and as a means of integrated development of a particular area. For that, he took inspiration from all over the world, but especially from the Tennessee Valley project of the United States. And he picked up one of the rivers which was curse of Bengal at that time, and that was the Damodar River. For that, he visualized, conceptualized a whole project, how to control first the flood of the river and then exploit its water for integrated development of the area, and that led to later on to the Damodar Valley, DVC, Damodar Valley Corporation, which has been one of the harbingers of the government sponsored project to exploit natural resources of the country. After that, several other rivers were brought under control, and dams and other canals were created, as for example the Kosi project, the Gandak project, Bhakhra Nangal project, Hirakund project, etc. So this was a stepwise experience and understanding of the national problem and the finding ways and means how to to control them and how to utilize the national resources for the development of the country. So this was something like a experiment of a type of socio-economic R&D going on the Congress platform, or you can say on a wider platform of national movement. And this was the background how Amin Saha met with the Congress President Subhash Chandra Bose, and he persuaded him to constitute a national high-power national committee which will draw up a plan for 10 years to be implemented after independence. After independence, because by this time most of Indians were visualizing the freedom of the country very much coming and very soon. So they were just readying themselves to with a plan, so that once the freedom dawns, they will set into action and implement that plan for national reconstruction. So in this way, the National Planning Committee was constituted by the Indian National Congress President Subhash Chandra Bose in 1938, and this was a high power committee. Of course, it was not a government committee. It was constituted by the Indian National Congress, but the Indian National Congress was the largest forum which was heralding and leading the national freedom struggle. So it had some value and it did have some impact. The National Committee was the core committee of the National Planning Committee, but under that there were about 29 subcommittees which would deal with different aspects of life in India. And all these committees did have as members or secretaries or chairmen, presidents, etc., one of the best brains of the time in different areas. For example, the scientists, the politicians, the businessmen, industrialists, economists, sociologists, and all that. The best brains were there. They delved into the exercise right from 1938, and they kept on working, but in the meanwhile, the Second World War broke out. And in fact, meanwhile, in 1937, even provincial autonomy had been introduced, and there were some government in the provinces led by the members selected by the Indian people, and they were trying to implement some ideas of the National Planning Committee or similar to that. So this was the time. There now with the Second World War, there was problem, and at that time, as we know, finally the provincial governments, they resigned due to different reasons, including the interference by the colonial government, but also on account of the Second World War, and thirdly, with a purpose that now the India will call for full freedom, and they will call for the Quit India movement. So the Quit India movement was started in 1942, and after that, immediately after that, most of the leaders, Congress leaders, they were sent behind bars. So including the chairman of the National Planning Committee, Jawaharlal Nehru. So the work of the National Planning Committee was badly disrupted. In fact, it was stopped, and it was only after the end of the Second World War in 1945 when the situation crystallized in favor of India and the freedom of the country was very much knocking at the doors. Then again the committee resumed its work, and between 1945 and 1949 the committee published about 25 volumes of reports. Those reports are a great legacy for the nation. Those reports means the idea of the report. The main feature of this report and this committee's survey and exercise was that it visualized a concept of developing the country with pre-planning. First thing, developing the country with planning, modern planning, based on modern science and technology, and this concept of development was free from almost all the contemporary prejudices, and many of them which still prevail. For example, it didn't have any consideration for any caste or creed or any religion. It was going to draw a plan for the development of whole of the society. In fact, in some of the members, including M.N. Saha, they were thinking not only planning the resources of the country, he was thinking that a situation should be created for the planning of the whole of the resources on this planet for every human being. So this was a very futuristic attempt at that time, and as we know today, in fact, all the government headed by the UNO is going towards the same direction, same goals, to control the resources of the world for the benefit of the mankind, every human being on this planet. So it was realized even at that time, like M.N. Saha. On the just another side of this planning on modern lines, we can just go a little back and talk about Gandhi also. Apparently, there is impression that Gandhi was against modern science and technology. He was not having any clear idea of planning and development. His ideas were based mainly on emotion and sentiment tinged with religious feelings. All these things are there, and at best his ideas were abstract, which were not applicable in real life. These are some of the criticism. There are much more others also which have been put forward in the past against Gandhi, and a confusion has created as if the progress made in the field of idea and planning during 1935 was hostile towards Gandhian philosophy. Apparently, it seems to be, but a closer look has been given to Gandhian philosophy in recent years, and even historians who was very much opposed to him, now they are revisiting Gandhi with a very sympathetic attitude. And in real life, all over the world, we can now relate with several of the problems with the Gandhian philosophy. Take, for example, the question of violence, the question of decay of or exhaustion of international resources on this planet. So if we have to find out some ways and ways out for saving the humanity and natural resources of the earth, we may like to revisit Gandhi in a positive manner. And there are several insights and inspiration which we can articulate even in controlling the resources and managing our societies in a better way today. So these are the some of the developments at that time which we would later realize how they were admired after independence and how they were adopted and taken over for the future progress of the country. Likewise, there were other plans at that time, for example, by Bombay Plan, a plan by M.N. Roy, Gandhian plan was there, and there was a large idea, the cross currents of ideas in the 1940s. We may recall that this was the peak period of the freedom struggle, but this period was faced by several problems coming from across the border. For example, or from within also. For example, there was a great famine in 1943. For example, there were communal riots in the country. There was a communal divide in the whole of the Indian society. These were some of the problems coming from within. But there were other problems also, that a new type of imperialism was entering entering India in 1940s, and that was the entry of the United States of America. So one country, one imperial country, Britain, was retreating, but another country was coming on the national scene to influence both politics and economy and diplomacy of India for the future. This was the period which America entered the Indian scene during the Second World War period. This entry of another power, great power, had much more implication both for politics and economy of the country, because there were two trends of development earlier. One, something based on indigenous knowledge and indigenous management. Later on, in 1930s, another parallel concept, model of development came based on socialism, and Western model of development based on modern science and technology. But during this period, 1940s, with the American entry, a lot of confusion was created, not exactly on account of entry of America, but our whole situation prevailing in the country and the international scene. What was the impact of this cross current of this time was a muddling of the idea of the development in this country. Means now there were no clear-cut ideas how to develop India. There were some people who wanted to develop India on the capitalist model, Visvesvaraya and the whole industrialist group represented at the Bombay Planning. Then there was another group, the socialist group, who wanted to develop the country on socialist model and with the help of modern science and technology. There was still another group, something like Gandhian, who wanted to develop country with indigenous knowledge and science and technology, means cottage industry, a small scale industrialization, self-sufficient village economy, etc. So then there was another group represented by M.N. Saha. So there were a lot of people presenting their models of development in the 1940s. Fortunately, the situation compelled the Indian leadership to concentrate on some, and what emerged on account of this rethinking by national leaders, later on emerged as a model of mixed economy, which was later on accepted and promoted by Jawaharlal Nehru. So, from the past, from the period of colonial rule, in the field of progress, material progress, two things became very important. One, the concept of development of planning, and the second, development on the with the help of modern science and technology. Earlier, Jawaharlal Nehru was a staunch socialist, and in fact, he wanted to develop India on the models of socialism and turned the Indian society into a socialist society. But the situation that forced him to compromise to a mixed economy model, which was reflected in the National Planning Committee report, and later it was further diluted after independence. Nevertheless, all these developments gave Indian leaders an experience of trial and error, of thinking and rethinking on the question of developing the country. And this was the genesis of the 5-year plans of independent India. I have already talked about the concept of freedom. I have talked about how the exercise in planning and idea of development and models of development. In the same way, we can briefly discuss, which is otherwise very much known, that greatest of all, our freedom movement gave us a constitution, which is a constitution that has consideration for everybody, irrespective of his creed or caste. That constitution that provides safety to those who are downtrodden and those who are needy. Likewise, this constitution has given us fundamental rights. It has given us civil rights of speech, right of living, right of having property, and a lot of other things that came from that. And that constitution, that is the quality of the constitution, which was essentially made in terms of idea before independence, and that has sustained the Indian democracy, and that has led to the greatest contribution of our freedom movement in terms of a democratic society, a democratic government which is stable despite the international and national troubling forces. It is existing, and it is one of the most stable society in the world on account of many things which we have inherited from the freedom struggle, from the ideas and ideals of people like Gandhi, like people like Jawaharlal Nehru, Bhim Rao Ambedkar, and a host of others. But there is time that we should also consider of numerous other sections of society who have made contribution to our knowledge, to our understanding of the problems of our society. They may include the women, the downtrodden, the scientists, the technocrats. We should take into account their efforts and achievements also. So this is about that period. We can now also think about how these legacies have been utilized and articulated to make our Indian society better than it was before independence. From that point of view, the scenario is rather mixed. Of course, we have got the independence, we have got the constitution, the idea of democracy, the idea of socialism, the idea of humanity and international cooperation and coexistence, etc. But the problem is that now there is serious deviation after independence about certain things. And one of the first to catch our eye is the power politics, the politics of vote, the misuse of democratic norms and conventions for getting oneself into power. This is one of the greatest problems. Likewise, the idea of socialism is sidelined now. Our constitution, the existing constitutions, mentions about aspiring and endeavoring to make the develop Indian society on socialist lines. But several of the recent development, especially in the field of economy, deserve to be noted that they certainly are not in the spirit of socialism envisaged by our constitution. On the question of economy, which we talked about in terms of national reconstruction, there is duality, both at the level of the governments, successive governments, both at the center and the provinces, and public at large also, intellectuals, policy makers. There is duality on whether to develop India on capitalist line, socialist line, or something Gandhian model. There is a lot of contribution, and in some way this contribution, this confusion is rather rising very fast, because trends, the political call at the time of vote is something different, and what some of the successive governments have taken into measure, they go on another field. For example, the free economy, free market economy is in no way going to promote the socialist model of development in this country, and the other economic sustenance, it's not going to promote it, but it is happening. Free economy means free competition, and that way something to be attacked in terms of indigenous production unit, cottage industry, etc. So, on account of the recent policy of economic management, there is confusion. I am a historian and I am not competent to comment on all the technical matters, but as one who has tried to survey the historic developments, I can have a little of insight, and so I am making this statement. Likewise, there is another problem of which is concerned with Gandhian philosophy, which made us successful in our freedom movement. The question of protest, the question of expression of one's ideas, the question of agreeing to one's conscience and fighting for that is in trouble. As we are seeing, there are a lot of movements, Anna Hazare and other movements are going, and there is problem to whether to allow these type of movements or not. So, if we visualize Gandhi's movement, Dandi March, etc., and the developments today, there is something disturbing thing. The disturbance may be from both sides, both from those who are on the stage and creating the heralding the movements. There is some also problem, but the problem is also from the side of government, which at times tries to crush these type of problems with methods which are not very much pro-public and not very constitutional, especially in the terms of ethics. And greatest of all problem is the vanishing ethics and morality from our politics, which was very much admired before independence. Thank you very much.